Welcome back to Muscle TV podcast. It's great to be back for another episode. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and co-host, Scott Goble. Scotty, welcome back, my friend.
Thank you. I just want you to know it's not my choice of curtains or bed sheets. I am at my mother's house in a spare room today. So let's just get that clear.
Nice. And today we've got a special guest. We've got a man who's one of my good friends, Aaron the Beast Cordina. Many reasons why we wanted to get the Beast on here. He's a lifetime trainer. He's been an athlete his whole life. He's a current bodybuilder. He's a physiotherapist. He's even got a couple other degrees there, engineering, and it's business management. But the real reason I wanted to get the Beast on today is he shares my unique cultural background of being Maltese, Irish, and Australian. And you're the first one I've ever met with that combo, Beast. So welcome to Muscle TV podcast.
Thanks for having us, boys. It's been a pleasure to come on. Thank you.
Thank you. And today's topic is all about what are some very common injuries that might come about if you are a serious trainer in the gym. So you're training 3, 4, 5 days. You love what you do. There are some fairly, I guess, predictable injuries that might come about from doing resistance training. And the big man, Aaron Cordina, is going to break it down. Would you say, Beast, that for when it comes to injury prevention and injury management, it's kind of like compounding interest for maximum muscle gains? Like the longer that you can do injury-free and the longer you can do training at your top level sort of athletic performance, the greater the results will be over time, and it tends to have a bit of a compounding effect.
Yeah, mate, I couldn't agree more. So pretty much what I tell my patients in clinic or athletes I work with is the best form of progression is injury-free lifting. So the longer that we can keep you lifting injury-free, the better progression we're going to get across the board, irrespective of whether it's bodybuilding, football, athletics, boxing, whatever it might be, MMA. If we can keep you injury-free for as long as possible, you're going to get the best result.
And we know how serious injuries can be. I mean, look at Scott's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu career and how that was destroyed by injuries. So, so was my surgery.
I do remember that episode, actually. It was a nasty bruise you had on the inside of that adductor there, Scotty. It was pretty wild, man.
Yeah, and that was the least of my concerns when it came to muscle tears, that one. So, yeah, shook that off pretty quick.
Nice.
Well, mate, let's start off with the big fundamental movement pattern, the hip hinge. It's one of those foundational movements like a squat and a bench press, isn't it? It's kind of, it draws a lot of attention, and rightly so, when it comes to maximum athletic performance, strength, muscle development, prevention of back injuries. It's absolutely critical. But it is a very complex movement. You're working multiple joints, using multiple muscle groups. You're trying to generate the maximum amount of force. So it's certainly not a beginner's movement, is it, Beast?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. People actually probably don't give it as much credence as you should, like you alluded to there, Luke. We use it in everyday movement patterns, picking the kids up off the ground, taking the groceries off the floor, picking up a 250 kilo bar in the gym. They're all sorts of things that we need to do with a hinge pattern. I see a lot of it where people just don't do correct lifting mechanics. And this is a sort of movement pattern that technique definitely does matter. You hear a lot of things these days floating around, but like the late Andrew Locke used to say, technique matters, context matters, and I couldn't agree more. So I see a lot of people in the clinic day in, day out with low back pain because I specialise, pardon me, in a lot of spines and shoulders. And probably 9 out of 10 of those people don't know how to hip hinge correctly. So usually what I'll do is I get them in the clinic, I'll set up and I'll say, look, just show me how you pick something up off the floor. It could be a medicine ball. I've kind of, I had a lady the other day, she was probably mid-60s, come with low back pain. I only get some when she picks up the grandkids. So we sort of mimicked it in clinic. I said, just show me what you're doing, if you pick up your grandson. She did it, and it was probably one of the most horrendous sorts of, she just tried to rip him off the floor, right, the medicine ball. I said, Jesus, I don't think I'd want to be your grandson anytime soon, Margaret. But yeah, it just goes to show you that she didn't put any thought into it. The body just knows it has to do a job, and it was getting that young fellow off the floor. So she just walks over and just picks it up. And I cringed the entire time. And I said, this is why we're getting some low back issues, right? So a lot of it is winding that back, some bad habits, and starting from the principles of where we initiate the movement pattern.
And would you say that would you say that a sedentary lifestyle contributes to the inability to move through the hips if you're sitting down a lot, if you're driving, you're at work, and like would you say, for I guess the viewers at home to understand, when you say they have bad form picking up something off the ground, we talking about essentially spinal flexion and no movement through the hips?
Yeah, you nailed it on the head, mate. So two things there. The first thing you brought up was like our sedentary lifestyle. A lot of people have desk jobs these days and sit a lot. That means we're already in a lot of like hip flexion already, right? So hip flex and everything can become quite tight. We get a very like rounded shoulder, sort of in lay terms, sort of posture, typing and stuff like that in front of us. Puts us in some really poor lifting positions for most of the day. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me. The worst, the sort of perfect storm for someone to sort of jacking their back up would be someone that's just come straight from the office. They've been sitting down for 8 hours. They bowl straight into the gym. Limited warm-up, limited pre-activation. They just get onto the end of the bar, pull it, rip it, bang, prolapse a disc. Happens super frequently because we've got to try and tune the body to the stimulus we're just about to put it under. And I think being deconditioned and sedentary is probably one of the worst things we can do. And we sort of lose that natural ability to hip hinge that we've done for thousands of years, millions of years, whatever it might be, right? So yeah, I definitely think it contributes.
Would you consider it a fundamental movement pattern? Or I guess you're saying it's a complex movement pattern, but I just think about how young kids move and just picturing my daughters, if they're to bend something and get something off the ground, it is full spinal flexion that takes place. Now, if I ask them to perform a squat, it's damn near perfect. Like they can squat flat-footed, perfectly neutral spine, but they cannot hinge to save their lives. So if you're a beginner that comes into the gym, it probably makes sense to me that they're not familiar with how to do it. So maybe what's the starting point if you do get someone that's going into the gym for the first time? Because we know if we're performing any sort of, rowing motion or any deadlifting motion or anything like that, we need to hinge. Where do we begin?
Good question, Scotty. That's a good point. And yeah, we're supposed to hinge. It's a natural movement pattern biomechanically that humans are supposed to do. So a lot of the way I would start in the clinic, so to speak, or in the gym, is a good couple of side-on views, the rear view as well, to see what's happening, to see where they start to initiate the movement. Is it happening at the knee or the hip biomechanically? A lot of the time, humans will do the most easiest thing to get the job done. And most of the time, unfortunately, that means they're going to start at the knee and then flex the spine to pick something up, right? It's biomechanically, it's easy. It's not the most optimal way to do it for like injury mitigation. So the first thing I would do is, okay, show me how you do it from the side. I'd have a look at it, see where the movement starts to initiate from the knee or the hip, and then start to make some added corrections to say we need to start to initiate the movement from the hip rather than the knee, and also start to look at where their spine moves in relation to them and the load, how close they are to the load, what the cantilever is on the spine, and then start to just sort of program them certain ways about how we can mitigate that, what that should feel like. So there's a number of different options I would use. Cueing is obviously the first thing we do, cueing by we're telling the individual about what we want to do. We pretty much learn in three sort of spectrums: audible, visual, and kinesthesia, like feel. So, I'd run through, telling them how I want to put their feet placement, where to hold the bar, so to speak, if we're doing a deadlift, how to start to initiate that movement pattern. If it looks horrific, then basically we dial it all the way back. And that could be basically just on the knees, on the floor, teaching a very, very rudimentary sort of hip hinge movement, kicking the hips back, pushing through the pelvis, just so they get that mind-muscle connection of this is how the hips are supposed to move through space. The benefit of that is we've taken out the lower limbs. We're not worried about what's happening below the knees, the ankles, etc., because that adds another level of complexity. So this is the first movement pattern, is to just sort of get those hips sort of moving back, if that makes sense. And then we progress it to like standing. What I meant before with those cueing sort of techniques, a lot of people have, you can tell someone, push hips back, and they do it. If they watch you do it, Scotty, they go, oh, I can see what he's doing, I'll do it. Sometimes that doesn't work. I find a lot of people need a bit of feel, kinesthesia. So I would put a band around their waist, so to speak, to put some tension to pull them the opposing way. So they're trying to fight the band, but their hips want to go back this way. So it's already sort of programming how they want to start to get that movement. And then over time, once we sort of ingrain that movement into their brain, then we can start to extend upon it.
I remember the great Andrew Locke had a saying that was always the body moves away from weakness towards strength. So is it a case of some of these poor techniques due to the fact that there's muscle imbalances? Like they've potentially got strong quads, they've got strong erector muscles of the spine, and they've got the weaker primary hinging muscle groups, the hip extensors, the glutes, the hamstrings, and things like that?
Yeah, you nail it 100%. So I'm huge on being a former engineer, mechanical engineer. I'm huge on numbers. So there's a couple of things we do in physio. It's like the Oxford scale testing strength, right? It's like at a graded 5 out of 5 system. It's okay if you want to come up with a bit of a ballpark, but I prefer numbers with a dyno. And almost 99% of the time when I see with people with back pain, you will see muscle imbalances, left to right. And they don't always, they sign up mix and match, inside to outside, like adductors versus glute med, for argument's sake. You get some big differences there. So those imbalances can definitely contribute to it. Also, like you alluded to, the fact that you get overactivation or underactivation of certain muscle groups. If they're very, very dominant in the quads, you might get a very different hip hinging pattern than you would someone that's a bit better through the glutes or the hamstrings. So yeah, unwinding that to figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are is all part of the puzzle, so to speak.
And let's say, Beast, that someone has a pre-existing back injury. Let's say they're trying to do some hip hinge movements and they hurt themselves. Does that mean that's it? They should stay away from that movement forever? Because I know a lot of people that I've helped over the years, if they have had an injury that has come about through hip hinging, they don't want to do any movement that is a hip hinge movement ever again. Should they be avoiding it fundamentally, or is it something that you need to retrain, address the muscle imbalances, the movement patterns, and it's actually a foundational part of overcoming a back injury?
Spot on, mate. You nailed it. You know me, we've worked together for a long time as well, rehabbing patients. I don't think I ever have told anyone never to do another movement again. It's about the right movement for the right person at the right time. So no, I would unwind them. I'd sort of desensitize them to the fact that, yep, cool, that hurts, but it's not going to hurt forever. And we're going to show you methods and ways around to make you stronger, or, pardon me, iron out those imbalances, so you will hip hinge again. I said it's a necessity out of life. Like Scotty said before, he sees his girls doing it all the time, picking stuff off the floor. If you can't sit down in a chair, you can't get in and out of a car, you can't pick up something off the ground, you're in trouble, right? That's a quality of life thing we need to address. So absolutely it will be a fundamental thing. Depending on the severity of the injury that I see with either athletes or normal Gen Pop people, the hip hinge movement is probably one of the later things that I start to bring in the full rehab spectrum. And it goes back to what Scotty said before. It's a natural movement. Everyone should be able to do it, but it is a little bit complex, right? So especially for someone that's working through pain. The worst thing you want to do is just throw them straight into the fire. You need to graduate them where they need to go, right? Like you said, Luke, fix the imbalances, get symmetry between front, rear, left and right, and then progressively, as we get, stronger and, less pain, they're going to be more tolerable to doing those movement patterns that first cause that issue. And if that was a hip hinge, then that's when we go. The final stage to that would be then deadlifting. Let's put them under some pressure. Let's prove to them what the rehabilitation has done is good, and they're safe to do that movement pattern. So that's generally, like in a nutshell, a real quick snippet of how I'd go about basically from like go to woe.
Is there a progression in terms of the hinging movements that you would start with? I've got a client who just last week bulged a disc in her lumbar spine performing an RDL. We think we know the reason and the cause for it. There was a little bit of knee extension prior to the hip extension. Very obvious popping sound. We've got numbness down the leg, numbness in the heel. It sounds like a fairly severe disc bulge, and we've got the scans to confirm that. So as she's coming back, she's a very competent lifter. It was an unusual incident, but is there a first hinge to reintroduce? Are we talking a 45-degree hyperextension just due to the strength curve of the movement? What would be the first hinge you would reintroduce? I'm just sort of thinking ahead to her future programming and stealing some free ideas from a man more qualified than myself.
Totally fine. So I would first look at how apprehensive she is in that movement pattern, because some people they do get very, very guarded when they put themselves back into that movement pattern, like, oh, Jesus, here we go again. So I would start and I would go from like all the way to the basics, on the ground, knees, sitting on your knees, putting a band around her waist, getting her pull back. I'd get her to do that and I'd say, okay, how do we feel? I'd look for the movement pattern, just build some confidence, right? And then just look at what muscles are activating and not activating. Then I'd probably get her to progress and then stand up and do the same movement. If it was happening more of a squat pattern or a deadlift pattern, I would leave that to end, whether we add a broomstick or whatever it's going to look like. Then once we feel like we're confident, then I would start to remove the band and then see how she starts to perform just naturally without any sort of kinesthesia, without any sort of assistance apart from cueing. And then I would hammer home the repetition. So the brain takes about 2,000 to 3,000 repetitions of anything before it becomes sort of semi, apparent. I've had people doing, I think I did one for one of Luke's clients as well. Like, I think Luke did it too with his back rehab sort of stuff with Dr. Locke, the wall squat, getting right to it and just practicing that movement pattern up and down. And I do very similar things with the broomstick, for argument's sake, to simulate down the back. It's a bit hard to demonstrate here, but a broomstick down the back of the spine where the individual will hold it on the back of their head, the other arm goes on the back towards their coccyx on the spine. That's a nice sort of way to keep that spine nice and straight. That would be like my third progression to like a Hinge movement if they're struggling with like getting too much bend in the spine or too much lordosis, so to speak. And I would get them to do that for repetitions, 20, 30 a day, 50 a day, 60 a day. You times that by 7, you might get 350, 400 reps per week. So you start to see the math works out. We need to do this for 5-6 weeks before we can really be confident that we've got that movement pattern down pat. Now, that's not the only thing we would do at the same time. We would start to continue still working through those muscle imbalances at the same time so they get more confident.
Basically, if the client has had a back injury or numerous back injuries, and often they have been very hesitant to get back in the gym and load their spine, is it possible that the erector spinae, the ones that are responsible for bracing it and controlling that neutral position, do not have the capacity to then generate the force to do so? And if that's the case, is it a case of building up through those isometric contractions, or do you actually put in spinal flexion and extension in order to strengthen the erector spinae?
Yeah, so normally what you want to do, and I had I suppose the pleasure and I suppose the benefit to work with Andrew Locke for the last 12 months before he passed away, God bless him, in his spine mentorship. And we went over this in detail, and I'm a big believer of it too, and I've put my own twist to it as well. So if someone comes into me with a spine problem like that, I want to get them strong in 3 planes of motion predominantly. Frontal, side, and then transverse. What you're referring to there, Scott, is probably more like erector spinae, multifidus, all of the intersegmental spine stabilization, really, really important muscles. They're very deep, they're intrinsic, right? So as a part of that, I would start to load in those particular movement patterns first to make sure we've got really, really good spine stability. Then once we're good in, the core, transverse abdominis, we're good on the side, so glute med and stuff like that. Side planks are a great movement for that sort of stuff. Then we start to work through some glute max. Then we also start to work through some proprioception stuff. This is all happening concurrently, right? Proprioception as in how we move through space. To believe it or not, a lot of that stuff is going to come down to some specific sort of balance work to unpack the bad habits that we've formed. Because like I said before, the body will just get the job done. It doesn't necessarily think about what the after effects is going to be. So I see it in clinic all the time. Low back patient comes in, I get him to like a single leg stand, eyes open and then eyes shut, and they just go to pieces. One side is predominantly always better than the other, and I can almost guarantee you I can already pick which side is the fundamental thing where the disc has happened, right? Just from that movement pattern alone. A calf is also another one, like an AMRAP for a calf is very important. Because a lot of these things, if you think about it, every piece of tissue has fatigue and load capacity, and it's like your cup just keeps getting filled up, right? So when people come in, I've had many people come in as I've just ripped the bar off the ground, I've been deadlifting fine, everything's good. I went down and picked my keys up, and that's when I jacked my back. So in that instance, it wasn't so much the load of that particular task that pushed them over. It was their cup was just too full. And that little bit of poor lifting mechanics was enough to just tip them over the edge, and bang, there's your problem. So we need to unpack that. And a lot of the times that has to happen is they don't know what they're doing until you put them under pressure with like a single leg stand with their eyes closed, and they go to water like, oh my God, this is terrible. Something simple like that with the calves too. You'll find that, one calf will highly likely be more dominant than the other. So one will gas out a lot more before the other one. That's telling me how their hip translation is working when they're walking with their gait pattern. So that's an example of where that cup just keeps getting full with a poor gait pattern, and then before you know it, boom, you've got trouble. So you've got to unpack all of those things. And then going back to your original question, Scotty, then yes, once all those things I'm happy with that we're moving and the strengthening balances are down, I will start to load them in those particular movement patterns in a graduated sort of form. two things: to A, get the muscles strong enough and ready, but also to give the individual a lot of confidence, which is huge. I want to empower them to basically take this sort of rehab at that point on, because it's a good lifting mechanics they're going to have to employ for the rest of their life. So they need to feel like they're in charge as well.
Let's think beast now for our viewers at home, looking to put on the most amount of muscle possible. Are the hip hinge movement patterns and all the similar exercises, are they absolutely essential? Can you get a good posterior chain, back, hamstrings without it? Or is it really a core component of a bodybuilder's repertoire of exercises they need to be doing on a regular basis?
Good question, mate. No, 100% unequivocally, they are necessary. Again, think about how hypertrophy works. All you boys, pro bodybuilders, you've been doing it for a long time. Mechanical tension's our best weapon to sort of build some mass, some muscle, right? And the good thing about those big defining movements you mentioned, Lukey, was, they're going to allow us to move the most weight possible in those given sort of movement patterns. RDLs, for example, I don't think you're going to struggle to find, curls are awesome too, but you're going to struggle to find another movement pattern that you can elicit that sort of response on, the glutes and also the hamstrings predominantly, because you can go heavy and it's nice and controlled, and you can really build some good mass with a movement pattern like that. Same as deadies. I'm a little bit two minds. My mindset with respect to bodybuilding and deadlifts is a little bit different sometimes, depending on the individual. I think, I know Sebastian Oreb too, he's of the same sort of opinion, so to speak. Not putting words in his mouth by any means, but we've had numerous chats where you look at like a deadlifting pattern, he would classify that as more of a strength movement. And if you want to do more of a bodybuilding movement, you would do more of an RDL, more hypertrophy. So my thought process is very similar. Do I do deadlifts in my programs? Yes. Do I do more RDLs? I do more RDLs than I do deadlifts for that particular reason.
And could you just potentially break down some of the different exercises there, Beast? You mentioned deadlifts and then you've said RDLs, very, very similar movement patterns. And if we even throw, say, a stiff-legged deadlift or even a dumbbell variation, can you give our viewers at home some insight as to how they potentially target the body differently?
Yeah, so it all comes down to like the biomechanics of the movement pattern. And it also depends on the person's anatomical structure. Like I know you, Luke, you got to stand on a certain amount of height. I think Andrew Locke worked through that a few years ago for you to be able to deadlift. So you couldn't deadlift at a certain height because of your femur length and hip socket depth, etc. Right? So anatomy can play a big difference with how much effectiveness some of these movement patterns can work on some people. But barring that, I would say essentially the main difference is knee bend, predominantly with a deadlift versus a hamstring, say RDL. What you want to try and do, whether you call it a stiff leg or a slightly bent knee, RDL, what we're trying to do, muscles always contract, they never push, right? So if we can hold those 2 points together and we pull them together, we take out all the passive tension, you're going to elicit the most response through that muscle group. That's essentially what's happening with an RDL. You're not actually deloading the bar onto the floor, so you're keeping that muscle under stretch as long as the knees don't continue to bend through that movement pattern. As soon as they start to bend through that movement pattern, you do start to take maybe less tension through the hamstrings, and predominantly it starts to shift towards the quads. So it becomes a bit of a hybrid sort of, hybrid movement that's not really getting the best out of both worlds. And that's one thing I do see a lot in the gym. I see people going too heavy on a movement pattern like that, and their forward and back knee translation is just excessive. So it looks cool because they're shifting a lot of weight on the bar from RDL, so to speak. But from a purely efficiency point of view of what you're doing, you're probably better off taking some load off that bar, keeping the knees locked, even with a slight bend is my preference, and then hinging properly at the hip to really elicit the most sort of stress on those hamstrings.
Can you resolve a long-standing question? Is there a difference between a stiff leg deadlift and an RDL? I am of the opinion that there is. I think at a stiff leg deadlift, you have a slight bend in the knee and you maintain that tiny bend the entire time. And by doing that, you're essentially fixing the knee joint, and therefore you should be increasing the contractile force of the hamstrings because they obviously cross both the knee and the hip. Whereas if you perform what I would consider to be a more traditional RDL, where you do have a relatively stable bend in the knee until you get to the knee joint, and then you go a little bit lower with some knee flexion taking place, that would load the glutes a little bit more because now the hamstring is lengthening over one joint and shortening over another, and it therefore becomes inefficient. Am I completely off the mark here? Because this is what I've been teaching for 15 years. So
No,
that's okay.
I'm here to tell you I concur with your analogy there, Scotty. So,
All right, good.
yeah, you hit that beautifully on the head, mate. And it's exactly like you said. It's all about looking what muscles cross what joint and what's being held stationary and then what's being moved. And if you can get that puzzle figured out, which you eloquently put really, really well, there's a difference. There's a subtle difference. So, yeah, I agree, mate.
And in terms of cueing, like if you're to cue things, because when I was performing stiff leg deadlifts and RDLs and things like that, my entire focus was a tight posterior chain. However, these days there's a lot of emphasis on tuck the chin, brace the core. And to me, you're creating flexion forces in the spine doing that. I don't know, like I'm not an expert in these things. That's why we've got you on. Where do you place the emphasis, or is it again a context thing and dependent on the individual and what they're looking to achieve?
This one, I kind of agree with you in your first concept. So you want to basically stay nice and rigid. The chin tuck and the flexion, I'm not a fan of. I don't believe that you need good lat activation. See, the one thing I see people struggle with when they do RDLs is they're not strong in the back. And if you can't really hold that bar in a particular position with your lats, and you get too much forward translation with your shoulders, then automatically you go into spinal flexion. Automatically the cantilever increases on your spine exponentially. Then the injury risk starts to go up quite high. So I'm a big believer of basically, I always teach my athletes or even Gen Pop people, start at the ground up. You set your feet, set your knees, slightly bend them, lock them. Armpits to the floor, which is a good saying, like a gunslinger thing. So what we're trying to do is, shoulder blades back and down to turn the lats on nice and hard. Then we're going to come up and just take the slack out of the bar, and then we're going to extend by standing up. Nothing should move at that point, right? And then, so no, I'm not a big believer of getting rounded shoulders or chin tucking of the chest. I think that's just going to promote some poor posture and possibly move into like a flexion movement as opposed to a flexion moment, which then it becomes dangerous for like a prolapse disc or disc bulge, etc. So no, I'm of the opinion you need to stay nice and rigid. You want to elicit the most benefit on that muscle, you need to, what I believe, you take the passive stretch out of the muscle. So if you can take out the slackness of, say, like an elastic band and then load it, you're going to do far better than having a sloppy elastic band than just trying to load it like that, right? So yeah, I would say rigid. I'm not a big fan of like rolling the shoulders or chucking the chin. I think it puts you in poor posture biomechanically to lift that load.
And in this conversation, Beast, is there any room at all for the barbell rack pull, or is that an upper body movement and we shouldn't be talking about it in this hip hinge segment?
Good question, one I get all the time. So I'm actually a huge fan of rack pulls. And again, I believe personally a lot of this is to do with like individual anatomy. So for me, for argument's sake, when I deadlift, because I'm quite tall, probably around like Scotty's height, my femurs are quite long and stuff like that, I usually tend to feel a little bit more lower back pump than I would anywhere else, like over glutes, over hamstrings. So for me to hit my back predominantly better, I would do like 2 or 3 inches below the shin. And if I rack pull from there, the back gets hit nice and hard. The upper mid back, like it's an excellent erector spino sort of movement. So that would be a tip for players at home, that if you just feel like you're constantly just getting a lower back pump from just doing deadlifts, there might be more to it than what you're doing, technically. Could be an anatomical variation, right? Try a rack pull. If it's an extra 3 or 4 inches off the ground and you can elicit like a really good semi deadlift that fashion, go for it. I think that's what Andrew had you doing, was it, Lukey, when you were doing your deadlifts? He was raising you up off the floor for that particular reason?
That's right. To get so there wasn't so much loading going through, and it was a great movement pattern to retrain on. That was one of the reasons why I was asking, because I retrained a lot on the wall sit and the rack pull, and I have now actually progressed. I can do deadlifts off the floor in the gym. Yeah, yep. But initially it was the rack pull and the sit to stand. But I know that a lot of people find it a very controversial topic whether the rack pull belongs in the same category of hip hinge movements.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, there is some hinging going on, so you can't disregard it. Like, it's going to be there at some. Well, you can't not hinge without like extending, so there's going to be some hip hinge. Funnily enough, I actually use a rack pull too with people that are very apprehensive doing like hip hinging if they've jacked their back with a deadlift. So, to get some confidence back, we might quite start high, like well above the thighs at a rack pull height. And then progressively, as we get stronger, going back to what I was saying to Scotty before, if you do you load the erector spinae, this is kind of where I would do it. I would go over a high sort of rack pull, and as we get stronger and more confident, I would start to lower that bar, right? So then the stress starts to become increasingly, but at a modulated rate. A, with their confidence, and B, with their strength capacity. So that's going to give me a good range to basically, you can work them quite hard because, there's the bar there. You can't really do too much damage. It's not going to go any deeper into deep flexion. And it's a really nice way to sort of gauge and show your clients too, of you're making progress, strength is up, and guess what? We're getting more range, and we're doing it safely. And then the end result is we take away the rack as per se, and they're just doing a free frame deadlift.
Yeah, early on in the piece, we were talking about, setting yourself up for a lower back injury and being stationary at work and sitting down and all that sort of stuff. Now, that is the reality of a lot of people. They have to, be in the office for a long period of time, and they drive to the gym, and they are in that position. So what would you recommend prior to them commencing their training in order to, I don't know, maybe, put the force in the correct spot or maybe loosen up the hip flexors or whatever it may be?
100%. Good question, mate. So a pre-activation routine is what I'd recommend. I can't remember the latest studies that I read, but it doesn't take very long for when we sit down sedentary for our entire posterior chain to turn off. The body is an excellent energy conservation machine. The old hunter and gatherers that we've heard Andrew talk about many times in the past, it's going to turn stuff off for energy preservation purposes, which means your glutes, your posterior chain turns off, all that good stuff that's supposed to hold us together just goes dormant because it's like, all right, in case of a famine, we need as much energy as we possibly can. So, sorry, Luke, we're going to save some energy here, mate, and just store it. That puts us in a really vulnerable position because all the passive structures start to take the load, which they're not designed to do that, right? So what I would suggest is you get up and you bowl into the gym, and it's not like a PAPE, we're not trying to enhance anything straight off the bat from like a performance perspective. What we do want to do is get a good neuromuscular sort of connection with the muscles we're about to work, like you just said, Scotty. So I would run through predominantly like a core activation and the glutes in particular, mainly because they're our main stabilizers through the hips and the spine, just to wake them up. It's called neural priming. It's sort of like opening up and turning in the radio before you hit full on the switch. And that way you're going to get a good muscle connection. The neural pathways are now open. And now you're in a pretty good position to start lifting sort of, risk sort of free. It's sort of like an insurance policy, I call it, with my clients as well, We can't guarantee anything in life. What we can guarantee is the effort we put into something. And if you put that amount of effort into that, it's going to hopefully translate to less injuries moving forward. There's a lot of studies that provide some good evidence to say that you get a really good mind-muscle connection from doing that. Motor pattern learning is a big thing. So what I would do, let's say for argument's sake, if you're going to do like more of a hip hinge movement, as opposed to say that's the first thing on your program, I would do, X, Y, Z, so maybe some transverse abdominal stuff. You could do like a McGill curl up, you could do a dead bug, something like that. But I would always finish on the movement pattern that I'm about to jump into. So let's say if it's a hip hinge pattern, I would probably do just like a hip thruster position with, say, a glute band around the knees, and I would just do some glute bridges. That's how I would finish. High rep, 20, 25 reps. It's not there to burn the muscle out. It's not there to sort of peak in, translate for performance when we do the deadlift. But what it is going to do is start to let that neuromuscular sort of connection form with the muscles we want to hit, and there's very similar movement pattern that we're just about to engage in. So that's what I would do.
Aaron, for my next question, keep in mind I did my exercise physiology degree 30 years ago and half the information is outdated. Is it possible through the use of glute activation that you could, through reciprocal inhibition, reduce some of the tension in the hip flexors?
Yeah.
Stretch?
Yeah. So I see it a lot. When people sit in a flex position all the time, you get the antagonist muscle groups, right? If one's being very, very tight, you try and target the opposite one to try and wake it up. And it can effectively have some weird sort of phenomenon where it can sort of deload like the hip flexors and stuff. I actually see it in dry needling when I dry needle people. They might come in and, if I'm struggling to sort of elicit a local twitch response, say they've got a problem in the left shoulder, Believe it or not, I've actually needled him in the right shoulder and it's fixed the left shoulder. So that's a really neuromuscular sorts of things, right? So yes, it's plausible to believe that by doing that through the glutes, you can have an effect on the hip flexors as well. So,
Nice.
which is pretty cool.
Well, we might leave it there, Beast. But before we go, look, there is one video that still sticks with me to this day. It was of Scotty Goebel, 4 plates aside, stiff-legged deadlifts with some of the best form I've ever seen doing high reps, Scotty. That video has really stayed with me. But that was literally one of your bread and butter hamstring movements, wasn't it?
Absolutely was, yeah. It. I believe the stiff leg deadlift was the primary driver of my hamstring growth, more so than knee flexion movements. Because and looking back, back then we had no idea of the loading in the stretch position to stimulate the greatest hypertrophy response. But it always made me sore, and it always intuitively felt like it was the one doing the greatest amount of work. And maybe it actually was doing that. And it was 180 for I think 25.
That's right. It was crazy.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah, no,
I still remember that video.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of it. So even my lifting now, that's exactly what I'll do. It's all stiff-legged. I classify. I always have a slight knee bend, but to me, it's been the best form of progression for hamstrings, big time. So
Yeah,
love
nice.
it. Stop movement.
Well, thank you very much, Beast, for coming on. We're going to get you on for another episode and go through more potential risks in the gym. But for now, if you're liking this content, please give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and if you turn on the notification bell, you'll get notified when we release our latest episode. Thanks to Max's Protein. It's been another great episode. Thanks, Scotty. Thanks, Beast. And we will talk to you both soon.
Anytime, boys. No worries.
There's no cure for this one!